Good evening, Professor and class. My name is Tom Bohl, and our topic this week is the impact of dams on fisheries resources. What our assignment requires us to do is to pick an area of choice to study going by states. As you know, we had to pick the lists for the dam removals for 50 states, and that originally I was going to choose the state that I currently reside in, which is Missouri, but there were only two dams that were scheduled for removal, so I decided to choose Idaho for a few different reasons. The first reason being was that last week I did my paper on the steelhead, which their genus and species is Oncorhynchus mykiss, and that I had chosen the steelhead because years back when I worked for the Forest Service in Northern California, I had done quite a bit of fishing for them, and that. But even more so, I had also done some work for doing some volunteer fisheries work with the U.S. Forest Service. Some of the things we did was we rebuilt habitats for the steelhead. Like for example, we ended up pulling old rotten logs into the river so they would have places for shade. Also, we would float the river and we would do steelhead counts. We would do surveys of how many steelhead we would see in different tributaries of the river. So then you may be asking, well, why aren't you writing on in California instead of Idaho? Well, that's a good question. A lot of this does run together, and that for myself, Idaho has always been a great state of interest, even though I reside in Missouri now. I spent time there in Idaho when I was a kid. I just kind of fell in love with the place. Hopefully we get to get back there someday. It has the mountains, high desert, the rivers, just beautiful. It's kind of like an Alaska found in the lower 48. So I do have an affinity for Idaho. And as we all well know, salmon species, migratory fish species, they kind of go from state to state, so much of this does overlap. So that is why I chosen the area of Idaho, was just because I have an affinity for it, but I also do feel it is important for natural resources as well. So the species that we're going to go over for this are, and I'm going to name each of them off and which dam that they are respective to, and all these dams had come from the dam removal list. So the sockeye salmon, which is Oncorhynchus nurka, that comes from the Sunbeam Dam. And then you also had the steelhead, which I talked about earlier, the Oncorhynchus mykiss. They are we were affected by the Dutch flat mine. And then finally we had the West Slope cutthroat and the bull trout, which were affected by the Colburn Mill Pond Dam, which to my understanding is still on the list but was removed earlier. And that's so the dams that I will be talking about in assignment number 2 will be discussed whether they have been removed or not. And there may be some other dams that get discussed in this paper later. I did forget to mention the West Slope cutthroat and the bull trout's genus and species. The West Slope cutthroat is the Oncorhynchus clarkae lewisi, which I assume that was to have been named for Lewis and Clark. And then finally we had the bull trout, the Salvinlinus confluentus. Those were the two that were affected by the Colburn Mill Pond Dam. And that, so all of these dams really had been a threat to the fisheries resources, and that mainly because of the fish ladders and all of these species trying to migrate back and forth from the rivers to the seas. And want to mention that again, they are all members of the Salmonidae. So they're all salmon, so they are going to have to go back and forth to spawn, but the dams basically impeded this process. So that's why I feel that's important to look into this further and study this and do more research about it. So thank you all very much.